Well, kia ora koutou, and welcome to this ECE Reform discussion video on ratios, space per child and group size. I'm Mike Bedford, I'm the Executive Officer of ECE Reform, and this video was developed for discussion amongst ECE Reform members as the second stage of our process of developing a proposal to take to government. So the first stage was a smaller discussion amongst advisors and hub leaders, just also other people that we knew that were happy to contribute some ideas, so that we could get a starter with a definition of group size, for example, and tables that would give us a beginning point that we think are a reasonable start, a conceptual start, but now we want to get the feedback from our members. As a little bit of background to the New Zealand regulations, we haven't seen any major change in our regulations since 1985, and at that time space per child was downgraded from the 1960 regulations, and the only other change that's happened, or changes that have happened that are significant, are the 2008 change, in which, by way of a change of wording, the regulatory space per child dropped by 10%. Now, there has been a little bit of debate around how the Ministry of Education was applying the regulations before 2008, but it's very clear that the intent in that regulation change was to reduce children's space, and that was by removing the word furniture, so now furniture was counted in free floor space. The other change that happened was ratio sharing in 2010, which really meant that those already very poor ratios could be pushed right to the bone. So children have lost out on regulatory changes really since 1960, as far as these parameters go. Looking at international comparisons, I actually did a survey across English language requirements in English across a number of jurisdictions, looking at Australia, North America, the UK, and across 34 jurisdictions, matching the wording, so that's looking at, did they include furniture or not, to get that right comparison. We came 29th out of 34, which by complete coincidence was where we sat in an OECD comparison that was done with a completely different method, but there we came out 29th out of 34 against another group of nations as well. So not a good look for indoor space. If we compare with Australia, their requirement is free floor space, so they have 3.25 square meters per child indoor space as free floor space. That equates to about 3.5, 3.6 if you were to match it to New Zealand wording. So we're a lot worse than Australia on indoor space. Their outdoor space per child is 7 square meters against our 5. So again, we're doing pretty badly there. New Zealand also compares badly with other nations on teacher-child ratios. And I would say that the most critical thing that we have to change as soon as we can is that ratio for children under 2, the 1:5 ratio, which is just unworkable. And I would say, as a public health specialist for the sector and a person with 30 years experience with the sector, that 1:5 ratio is dangerous, not only physically, but for children's mental and emotional health. So we've really got to put a priority on that, but we'll talk a little bit more about that further on. The other thing that needs to be said right at the outset here is that we're looking at what is achievable in change that can be actually got through government, but it has to be funded. So please don't look at the tables, don't look at the proposals for improvements and say, oh my goodness, we'd go broke if we tried to do that on current funding. Well, of course you would. That's not what we're proposing. We're saying, what do we think we can achieve as an improvement for children? And the government is going to have to meet that funding, or we're going to continue to see the collapse of the sector. Okay, so I've just mentioned the collapse of the sector. we have a number of issues, and obviously pay for teachers has been one of them. I would be totally supportive of increased pay for teachers, and I'm sure all of our members would be. Certainly supportive of pay parity in principle, but not in the way it was underfunded by the current government. So we've got to look to have teacher pay properly funded. And of course there are questions around whether it should be directly government paid, coming from a Ministry of Government, or left as it is as part of the bulk funding. But that's not what we're discussing today. In all of the discussions that I've had with teachers who have left the sector or made a move to go relieving, for example, some teachers have moved to home-based, some have gone primary teaching. Every one of the many discussions I've had with teachers, not one of them cited pay as the reason that they were pushed out of the sector. Poor pay was going to be a reason to not be held, if you like, but what pushed them out was the appalling conditions they were trying to cope with, of overcrowding, of noise, of stress, of unmanageable ratios, and of course issues like overload of paperwork, the administrative side. We're not dealing with that today. That sits more with other ECE reform proposals. But it's clear that we need to improve those basic regulations if we're going to stop the collapse of the sector. So the first set of changes that we need to talk about is ratios and group size. And these two things are absolutely interconnected with each other. You also, in addition to the ratios and the group size, we need to consider what makes a workable teaching team as well. So we've taken that into account. Now, both ratios and group size are absolutely about relationships. And one of the things I would say is that if you're talking about ratios in terms of supervision, just for safety, for physical safety, the standard is way below what it needs to be. The minimum standards need to be able to ensure that you have ratios that will mean that we never again have a teacher survey that has 29% of teachers responding saying they didn't have time to develop relationships with children, which is what we had from the 2020 Child Forum 4,000 teacher survey. That's one of the most alarming things I have ever heard. So that set of working requirements for ratios and group size needs to make sure that you have sufficient adult resource for children to make sure that children are in relationship, and that you don't have so many people that the complexity of relationships becomes too great. And that's what group size is about. Group size is about complexity of relationship. So if you have large groups of children, you can end up with a child who's just lost in the crowd, and the children's needs will be more and more difficult to meet if they have some subtlety to them. They need a bit of extra attention, harder and harder to do with a big group size. Now, having said that, again, with regulations, we can't necessarily regulate for best quality. We're still regulating for a minimum standard, but that minimum standard has to be better than we have now. We have, of course, the terrible conundrum that New Zealand is in, because improving ratios was left so long that now we have got a critical loss of teachers, which makes improving ratios so much more difficult. So in our stepwise improvement, we try to take that into account. When looking at group size, we've taken into account factors such as the reasonable operation of a teaching team, so that, for example, having a group size of 8 babies and toddlers as a maximum might be nice, but at a 1-to-4 ratio, that's going to mean you've got 2 teachers, whereas having 3 teachers for a group size is much better for being able to cover various needs. So that then puts your group size at 12 rather than 8. So these are the kinds of things we balanced up in the recommendations that we've made to start with. So it's important that we have a definition of group size, and I think this is something that has been a struggle for a lot of people who try to tackle this kind of question. So giving some considerable thought to it, what we've come down to here is that group size means the number of children in a spatially separated group with specifically allocated teachers, so that's the teachers who are counted in ratio for that group, but that's applied for 80% of the operational day. Now, I'll just mention that when we come up with a number of like 80% of the operational day, that's one of the things we want you to consider. Is that the right number? But the thought here is that we're not going to lock things down so tight that you don't have a little bit of flexibility to bring everybody together for a period of time and then go back to your home groups, if you like. So we're trying in these regulatory proposals to allow for some flexibility of operation. But what this group size will mean is that you have to design your centre for group size. You can't have a centre that is designed for a group size of 50. That is not going to be a go any longer. No big open plan barns. We're going to go for smaller groups for most of the day. Should say, very important here, this group size requirement does not apply outside. Outside, there's a need for more flexibility of arrangements, but that come back home environment indoors needs to have group size limits. So we use that term spatially separated group. So what does spatially separated mean? Well, we went technical on this one because you're thinking, okay, what about the centres that are built with big spaces for a lot of children? You're going to have to do something about that. So what we've said here is that spatially separated means separated from other groups by being in separate rooms, but that's where a room is a space that is divided from the other spaces by a barrier at least 1.5 metres high. So what we're saying here is you don't have to build walls. You don't have to do structural changes to your building to achieve group size. But on the other hand, no, you can't say, well, we've got the block table down here and that separates our two groups. That is not okay. The principle from the child perspective is that you need to make sure that the barrier that divides these children from those children over there is above child eye height, and the other function of this is also reducing transmission of noise in big spaces as well. Now, okay, so we've said 1.5 metres high. That means that for most adults, you would be able to see over the barrier. So from an adult point of view, you've got a bit more of a broader look. We could drop that number down. Should it be 1.3 metres? But the principle is that you must divide your group so that the children have the sense of being in a separate space from all those other children, that the relationship complexity comes down to something that is manageable. That's what group size is about. Okay, so now we're getting down to the nitty-gritty, the actual tables. Now, please remember, these are draft tables, so yes, we've got lots of numbers in there, but the question we're putting to you is, did we get the numbers right? But also, did we get the concept right? So first of all, just for clarity, this is about teacher-led. We're not dealing with parent-led centres in this situation, and wouldn't do that without having a lot of conversation with Play Centre Federation, working with them. So we're not going to be talking about that in this presentation. The other thing is that what you're looking at here is tables for an age-grouped centre. But there's another set of tables we'll look at next for mixed age. So this at the moment that we're looking at is age grouped. So one of the first concepts here that we thought was going to be helpful was to look at the length of a child's engagement with early education and care. There's a huge difference between sessional early childhood education and long day care. Okay, now I just use that term long day care. Sometimes people object to the term daycare or childcare, but we've got to be real here. That is the context. So what we try to do for most New Zealand children is to provide early childhood education in the context of long day care, or for some, school day times. Okay, so not very many children now are doing sessional early childhood education. But if you are doing sessional ECE, well, that is very much about the action. You know, you've got that time that is set up to be active time. You're not generally going to be snoozing in a 3-hour or 2-hour session. So that changes the amount of busyness that children can cope with. And that has an implication for group size, and also the relational needs of children in that time are different to what becomes second home when you're talking about long day care. So that means that you can get away with more children per teacher, and you can get away with bigger group size for the older children particularly, but then when you get down to the youngest children, really it's not an awful lot different. But in practice, there's not a lot of teacher-led centres that would be taking babies on a sessional basis. So normally they would be in a longer day environment, but we've allowed for it anyway. And so what you can see here is that across all three tables, the teacher-child ratio, the group size, and the group size as a multiple of ratio are the same regardless of whether it's sessional or long day for the infants. But when you get to the older children, that's where it really changes quite a lot. Another concept that I'll explain here that seemed to be quite useful in legislation. Apologies, I think I just sort of cut myself off short there because I was about to cough. So recovered now. So yeah, looking at legislation from other countries using a group size that was a multiple of the ratio seemed to be a good approach, because what it did was effectively define your team size. So you could look and say, well, is this going to work as a team? And we mentioned that earlier on. Another feature of these tables is that the age banding is overlapping and therefore flexible. The principle here is that the requirement will apply to the youngest child in the age band that you choose, but it's a lot more flexible than the current system. And when you're looking at something like 24 to 36 months and then 30 to 36 months, this is reflecting differences in developmental stages. Or you've got toddler under 30 months to walking. So that would be, you could do a group that is children once they're mobile up to 36 months if you wanted to. All of that is possible within this set of tables, but your ratios and your group size are going to adjust for the youngest children. A feature that we're very keen to get some feedback on, again, this was taken from other legislation as an idea, but not sure if it's the best idea, is that for infants and toddlers, rather than dividing it by age, it's done by developmental stage. So infants are defined as not yet walking unaided, and toddlers able to walk unaided up to 30 months of age. Should we change that? Again, it's the first cut. You'll see that when we look at the mixed age, we've actually approached that slightly differently. So there's two different ways that you could try it out. Now, when we look at the age groupings that we've put here, they're basically intended to reflect the current reality. So there are a small number of sessional teacher-led centres in the country, not very many, but they exist. Kindergarten has shifted almost entirely to school day, and there are centres that are long day with children 10, 11 hours a day. So you would simply choose the table that fits your centre. Okay, you're not going to be working with more than one table, you're not going to have some crazy complexity. It's just that one table, and you would decide how you want your age bands to work, and that will then tell you how your ratios are. And you could have it printed out and stuck it on the wall if people need it to, but in practice it's not that difficult to manage. One of the things that provided a little bit of a challenge here is to say, how long should we allow children to be in full daycare? So if you look at that maximum 11 hours for teacher-led long day, if we made it say 10 hours, I know from conversation with people in Auckland, the commuting times for parents can be quite long. So if you say, well, a child can't be in long day care for more than 10 hours, that's your maximum, rather than 11, what you might find is that instead of a child attending 10 and a half or 11 hours in a suburban environment, maybe with a nice outdoor area that actually has grass and trees, they're going to be bundled into the car for a long drive, and then they're going to be spending time in maybe a commercial industrial zone, which is not going to be as good for them. And so we would have done a disservice to the children by limiting the number of hours they can spend in the centre location. So you get that perverse outcome. By trying to do something better for the children, it can work against the children. So we have to weigh those things up and say, ultimately, what's going to give the best outcome here. So at that point, I'm going to leave you to have a look through those numbers and see what you think. I'm not going to talk all the way through the numbers on the table because that would be very boring. So we'll move on to mixed age. Okay, so for mixed age centres, we've just gone for one table here. And the way that we've cut this one is to say, well, in a mixed age environment, your starting age is going to be very important, and the proportion of younger children is going to be very important, because younger children place more demand on your teachers, on your ratios. So our starting proposal here is that if you take children of all ages, babies upwards, then you can't have more than 20%, 1 in 5 of your children being under 1 year old. Now you'll notice that here we're doing an age rather than developmental stage. This is really illustrating the two options as to which way we go, and so we'd really like to get some feedback on this. In this table, you can't have more than, for total mixed age, more than half of your children under 2.5 years old. Now, the way it tends to work is that because of differences in starting ages, you wouldn't normally have as many as half your children under 2.5 years old. So that's trying to provide a little bit of leeway for those lumpy, bumpy changes in enrolments over time. You see that also reflected in the next line where we're saying, okay, if you're not taking children under 1 year old, you can have up to 60% of your children under 2.5 years old, because you don't have the very the proportion of crawling age babies in there. But this again is to allow for fluctuations in enrolments. So how does this work out in practice? So if you come over to that box on the right hand side there, we recognise that dividing children into body parts for percentages isn't going to be very convenient for the children, messy for everybody else. So the percentages round down to whole children. So if, for example, you've got a 24 child group, totally mixed age, including babies, then there would be a maximum of 4 babies, four children under 1 year old, and a maximum of 12 children in total, including the babies under 2.5 years old. Does that number sound reasonable? Does it sound right? If you've got a centre for 28 children where you're not taking children under 1, the maximum number of children under 2.5 would be 16. Again, does this sound reasonable? Have you got the numbers right? Now, another thing that we've recognised here is that while the number of smaller sized centres, around 25, 30 children, has reduced in New Zealand, the mixed age centres characteristically tend to be smaller. So we didn't want to penalise mixed age centres by having awkward group sizes that were going to chop things up in a way that was going to really mess things up. So working with that combination of group size, ratios, maximum group size, we think this might work okay. A little bit of adjustment might be needed, but we've given the example down there that for a fully mixed age centre with babies, if it's a 36 child centre, you could have 2 groups of 18 children with 3 teachers each, and that will give you your 36 child centre. Remember that group size is not centre size, and group size is not requiring full walls. You can use dividers that simply provide a visual split and a noise barrier to some extent, reduction, and so you're not getting that big sense of a crowded, noisy room. You're bringing that size down, but you can still have, well, for example, we've made the note down the bottom there that one of the things that's developing at the moment is the village concept of centre design, which I'm really quite a fan of, actually. And that means that you can have the economy of scale of 120 or 150 child centre, but what the children experience is relatively small group. So you could have, say if we looked at the fully mixed age, biggest group size 24, you could have 6 24 child units within your big centre. So you're looking at 144 children. With all the management economy that brings, you can use a combined outdoor area that gives you the scale to be able to have more specialised activities outdoors, but you're still getting that group size benefit. So anyway, these are thoughts to think about. Again, we'd really like to get your comment back on whether we've got the concepts right and have we got the numbers right. Okay, so something I should have made plain with the previous slides was that those tables are the end game. That's where we're trying to get to, but we can't get there in one go. We've got this terrible conundrum that, amongst other things, having such poor ratios has driven teachers out, meaning we can't meet ratios. How do you improve ratios if you haven't got enough teachers? And I would have to say that argument has been used somewhat disingenuously by the government to not improve ratios. But if we don't improve ratios, we're going to lose more teachers. So we've got to bite the bullet and do something about this, and this is our best shot at answering that particular problem. Now, one of the things that you'll see straight away here is that we have an immediate introduction of group size, and that alone, that's one of the cheapest improvements you can get, is simply to put in that group size limit. And if you think back to that definition of group size, no, this does not mean structural changes to your building. For ratios, the top priority is to get rid of that terrible 1:5 ratio for children under 2. I personally, as a public health expert for the sector, I describe the 1:5 ratio as child abuse. It is not okay. It puts children at serious risk of attachment disorder, anxiety. you simply don't have the relationships in place at that ratio with the very youngest children. So we've got to change that as a priority. So we've gone to 1 to 4 as a first step. Now, there are a number of teachers in New Zealand who specialise in working with the under 2s. They love working with that age group, but the conditions have been so awful that they couldn't cope anymore. If we improve those conditions, we've got a good shot at bringing those teachers, or some of them, bringing them back. So that's how this is being hopefully managed, is to say, well, look, if we get rid of the problem, we can get the teachers back. The other change that you'll see there in that immediate category is a group size limit of 40 for children over 2 years old. I don't see there's any justification to having a group size bigger than 40 sorry, I should just qualify that. That would not apply to sessional over 3 years old. So all other children, maximum group size 40. Then we've got to wait for basically a planned recovery for the sector. Now this relies on teacher training and also on the goodwill of a government to say, can we actually trust them? Are they going to put these changes in place, or are they going to renege on them? So we've got to get through that period to try and get more teachers. So what we've said is, okay, after 2 years, we hopefully will have had some more teachers qualify. And whereas at the moment there's been a lot of teachers who have qualified and very quickly left when they realise how bad conditions can be. If we're improving the conditions, we might be able to retain more of the new teachers in the workforce and perhaps attract some back. So after 2 years, we're saying, okay, we're going to go with that. We've got the 1 to 4 for the under 2s. We're going to bring in a 1 to 8 for the 2 to 3 year olds. And we're still at 1 to 10 for the over 3s, but we've got group sizes in place for all of them. So this is the transitional phase, and then you step through to those much more nuanced tables at the end of 3 years. Now, anyone could opt to move to the new system at whatever point they want to, but they don't have to until the end of 3 years, so that gives you planning time. So that's it on ratios and group size. So I'd love to get your comments back. Tell us whether these numbers are workable. Tell us what problems you might encounter, and whether we've got that transition right. That'd be really helpful. So now we'll look at space per child, and what we're looking at here is kind of led, if you like, by the indoor space side of it. But whether it's indoors or outdoors, generally speaking, you can't have more space per child by increasing your building size, practically speaking, or increasing your land area. Increasing space per child means reducing your role. And that's why this has got to be funded. So please don't imagine that this is done with keeping the funding the same. It just wouldn't work. Now, again, it's a phased thing. We can't get where we would like to get to in one go. The end game, we've said, is matching the Australian standard. And if anyone can give me an argument to not be as good as Australia for New Zealand children, be interested to hear it. So that's where we're trying to go to. But the beginning point is after 6 months to shift to the standard that we used to have until 2008 indoors. So that's that 10% adjustment to claw back what was effectively stolen from children in 2008. And that means that if we keep, I think it's going to be more practical to keep the wording the same as it is at the moment, but to match that space per child up to what it would have been if it was clear floor space. So that means we're moving to 2.75 square metres per child. It's a 10% improvement. What that means is a 10% roll reduction. You can't just bring that in straight away. What are you going to do with the children? So you've got to have a lead-in time to allow the roll to drop. And in this situation, yes, you would have an exemption available. We're not going to see a child forced out because they're one child over that limit, okay? But so basically you wouldn't be able to enroll more children until you reached that extra space per child. Now, of course, this legislation wouldn't come in without anybody knowing it was coming either. So what this is going to create is a greater demand for centre spaces, and so there will be an expansion of the number of centres going along with this, and people would know about that in advance before the legislation came in. So then after 18 months, because it's going to take a bit more of adjustment to be able to get to that 3 square metres inside, we've allowed time for that and the same an amount of time for getting to 3.5. For new centres, now it would be nice to say, okay, well, all new centres have to be at 3.5 square metres per child, but that could create a disparity between new centres and older centres that could see some good quality older centres starting, to be not able to compete. So we don't want to mess that up either, although we've taken a slightly different approach on outdoor space. So for outdoor space, we've taken a very slightly different approach. What you'll see is that the staged improvements match to the staged improvements indoors. So because the minimum in the regulations is the outdoor area is twice the indoor, that's what you can see here. But the big difference is that we've gone straight to 10 square metres per child minimum for new centres. And this is because we just don't want to see any more of the tiny outdoor spaces being considered okay for children to spend long days in. We don't want children being told to use their walking feet outside anymore. This is not okay. So we've got to shift that expectation when you get the land to develop a new centre. And just for comparison on that, the traditional kindergarten and play centre environments throughout New Zealand, I know from working with, I've done something in the region of 30 outdoor area plans, mostly for kindergarten and play centre, and they were typically 15 to 25 square metres per child, because that's more the direction you're going to go in when you're designing for children's activities outdoors. The smallest one I ever worked with was 10 square metres per child, and that was quite constrained, but really noticed the limitation of opportunities. What are we going to trade off here against what we would like to have? So it's going to be too far to push it to a minimum of 15, which is what I would love to see. So 10 is a compromise, but we've got to remember that 10 is still not good. It may seem twice as good as minimum, but that's only because minimum is so bad. So we've really got to, I think, pull out all the stops to try and get better outdoor space for children. Anyway, so look, thank you so much for watching this, for taking the time. Really look forward to getting your feedback. We're allowing a week to get feedback from members, so we're a little bit of a tight time frame, but I'll put the date out with the email for this. I'm not going to put it into the video, and so looking forward to hearing back from you. And yeah, again, I just want to say thank you so much for your engagement. We really appreciate it.